This is Chapter 6 of The Bubble Bath Paradox by Steve Parker. Paul. Several of the uniformed people added their comments to Paul's to keep the joke going, because somehow this cramped box of a command center suddenly needed a joke about a funny hat. The joke dispersed into the atmosphere of the ICC, mixing easily with the flow of activity. Many of the people in oversized blue coveralls did not even look up from their tasks to comment, and because of the nature of Paul's magic, my hat was the focus of the joke. I was not the butt of it. Someone at the far end of the string of modules chimed in with a, "Hi, Ben Franklin." "Good afternoon, President Washington," said a particularly perky young woman who was almost lost in the huge pair of blue coveralls draped on her petite frame. It appeared, at least from the use of large one-size-for-all coveralls as uniforms, that this was a one-size-fits-all emergency response. It was a little comforting, knowing that the university did not have a specific researcher damages all of reality response protocol. "Good afternoon, fellow Americans." I tipped my hat to the room. There was scattered explosive giggling as a few people saluted me and then went back to whatever they were doing. A lot of it involved poking at the flush-mounted monitors many were seated behind. Dean Gross was nowhere to be seen, and so I left the possibility of running into him with my wet bag of clothes as I opened the door to the outside and escaped down the same stairs I had, just a few minutes ago, stumbled up with him. When I opened the door, there was a louder and different set of noises, and it was even brighter than the well-lit ICC. But it was that smell of fresh basil that really hit me. I was fresh, clean, and now on a mission to find pasta. Paul had been my roommate ever since I arrived at the university. He had already been a PhD student in the biology department for a couple of years when I arrived. I answered a notice he put up looking for someone to split his extremely low rent. He answered the door wearing the look of someone who had just cussed out an inanimate object and a green grocer's apron over a tie-dyed t-shirt and cargo shorts. I was dressed similarly, but without the apron. We were of the same, timelessly 100 years out of fashion, tribe. Instead of telling me about the room, or the rent, or the house rules, he asked me to come in and help him with a water bath recirculation loop. I knew I would be moving in before I set foot in the apartment. Paul is best described as not intimidating. He is not very tall or very short. I'm not sure how tall he is, really, as he appears of average height no matter who he is with. I would not be surprised if he used adaptive shoe inserts to adjust his height to be similar to the mean height of any group he was with. He may be the smartest person I know, even without his implants, but he is always asking more questions than providing answers. He isn't especially good looking, but he is not ugly, and he usually had a new gorgeous, overachieving woman bond to him every 6 months or so. Maybe they weren't gorgeous in the way Jane was, but the two of them would be laughing and smiling so brightly that everything around them was lit up and beautiful. It was fun living with Paul. I think he was wearing glasses when we first met. They might have been a data interface instead of for vision correction, but some of his earliest hacked implants would make them unnecessary in either case. His hair was also blacker than the steely gray it is today. There was at least 1 year that he experimented heavily with active pigmentation body art. One time, he and, I think her name was Libby, were passed out in a tangle on the sofa with images of brightly colored parasites squirming all over their exposed flesh and their hair flashing through all the colors of a neon rainbow. I wonder whatever happened to Libby. Even before the aerobargs, we always had some project going. The smell from the restaurant downstairs helped to cover up most of the failures. We were both experimental biologists and spent most of our time away from the apartment in a lab, but we had no desire to leave behind the spirit of tinkering and the pursuit of knowledge just because we were someplace we called home. Our apartment actually felt like a more natural place for us to experiment than the labs. Paul actually worked in 2 labs, 3 if you count the apartment. He had his research lab where he was theoretically stumbling through his 10th year of dissertation research, and his work lab where he did strange military contract stuff. Since all research in the biology department is short on funding, except for, until the event, my research, Paul's work lab where he earned the money he lived on was not in the biology department. It was in the biochem department. There he worked on a military project, one that involved biological targeting controls for smart munitions. They had basically created a chimera of canine and great blue heron brains that could learn, thought they could fly, and wanted to kamikaze into whatever the users imprinted on them. Whenever these controllers were used in combat, the news services broke out their backup supply of superlatives to describe the complex countermeasure and camouflage avoidance approach paths that the chimera-brained smart bombs were capable of. Paul often said that a truly smart munition wouldn't hurt anyone. Our place was upstairs from an often busy Asian restaurant that was continually being closed down for health violations. The availability of after-hours leftovers reduced living expenses. Most of the year, it was maybe a little loud in the afternoon. During the summer, we had to make sure that the windows on the side with the dumpster were closed, or insects and birds would force their way in. But it was a fine place otherwise. Okay, there was the smell, but it was not as bad as the one we would end up causing for the restaurant. Paul had been researching, for his dissertation, a species of tapeworm that infected the brains of mongoose from Bali. He would pontificate about the lumping and splitting of species in the taxonomy of these almost identical to me looking specialized parasites. His major professor worked with similar parasites in Macaca fuscata, the snow monkey, brains, and dismissed Paul's work as being entirely unrelated to his. I've never been convinced he really took any time to understand the research Paul was theoretically doing for him. I personally thought there was a lot of overlap between parallel efforts to study tapeworms in mammalian brains, but I'm obviously not the type of biologist who understands these things. Paul actually loved the complete obscurity of the dissertation research he was doing. There was one particular piece of lab equipment that Paul used to bring back to the apartment to play with every once in a while. It was an imaging and manipulation robot that was delicately tuned to manipulate the tiny larval forms of his tapeworm parasites while they moved about inside the living mammalian brain tissue. Paul was literally an amateur brain surgeon. This was, of course, how he got all his DIY implants. His skill with it also secured his position on the military research contract. His work with the smart bomb targeting brains did attract attention, especially after almost 100 of them were liberated by the poorly organized Sentient Liberation Army, SLA, and ended up in our kitchen. The SLA had messed with their targeting instinct so badly they were useless for munitions and were set to be destroyed. But Paul intervened on their behalf, and so now almost all of them were in frozen stasis in our kitchen freezer. We now had little room for food that required refrigeration, and came to rely even more heavily on the Asian restaurant downstairs. Paul was very well known on campus. He didn't know everyone, but he seemed to know at least someone everywhere we went, and it was no surprise that he could get himself into the ICC. Paul wasn't discredited due to the obscurity of his research. The obscurity of his research made him more non-threatening and acceptable. Most people knew Paul because of his hobby. Paul was breeding a colony of quasi-sentient sexual toys, or aeroborgs, as he called them, in our apartment. He had developed them as a peaceful and erotic repurposing of technology from the cyborg smart bomb program. He had plans to repurpose the actual targeting brains the SLA had left for him, These, because of their actual low-level sentience, would be able to develop emotional attachment to their owners. At least that was the theory. Smart bomb sex toys. What could go wrong? His aerobores were popular with a lot of people. They were a thumb on the nose to the military researchers on campus. Everyone loved to thumb their nose at the military researchers on campus, as they had unlimited funding and few visible morals. It was a blow for sexual freedom for those who could not afford the attractiveness upgrades that were supposed to be a prerequisite to effective dating in the 22nd century. And this was over half the campus, as it was a state school. A few steps off the bottom of the ICC stairs, Paul pulled me aside and asked, "What the heck happened in the museum?" "I'm not sure. It was supposed to be a quick sampling setup, and then it started to glow and made some noise, and we all ran for the door. And then there was blood and arms and faces. Faces frying in oil," I replied. "I think you need to develop a more cohesive narrative. You should expect to be asked that question a few times, and you sound like a lunatic," said Paul, with a tinge of concern in his voice. "Okay," I said, trying to muster cohesiveness. "My current theory is that the autosampler's PR expanded 1,000,000,000,000 times due to some as yet unexplained resonance. Instead of being about 30 microns across, it inflated to about 30 meters. A huge chunk of the past was transported to the present and replaced most of the museum." "PR?" asked Paul. "A paradox region." Paul was not very conversant with the jargon of time travel physics. It had a different lexicon than amateur brain surgery, a very different discipline. He had heard the terminology of time travel physics often enough and was certainly able to grasp the general concepts. The look on his face now announced that the understanding of what was happening was well beyond the limits of his grasp. You could tell that Paul was not comfortable learning what it felt like to just not at all understand something, a feeling most other people have countless opportunities to get used to. I personally had to understand at least a little bit about time travel, as it was the central tool I used for my research. I also comprehended how little I knew about it. Time travel physics was the metaphor for impossibly hard subjects in these early days of the 22nd century. The 21st century had the purge of historical and scientific information, and so many subjects were labeled as impossible to know. In the 20th century, the theory of relativity was impossibly hard. The 19th century began with an explosion of new theories in physics, but the last half was apparently dominated by misunderstanding Darwin's natural selection as impossible to know. There was so much happening in the 19th century. Darwin's theory did become illegal to know for part of the 21st century, but that is different. Willful ignorance is so much less noble than organically exceeding one's intellectual grasp. This field of 22nd century impossible knowledge is studded with terms dense with irony, like paradox implication field or simultaneous exclusion time radius. I have no idea what most of the terms mean, but I use them with impunity. My intellectual research certainly exceeds my grasp. The paradox region was calculated for single sampling events. It had something to do with unpaired spins remaining in a region that had lost some mass to the future. This was highly theoretical, as there were no accurate ways of measuring the displacement of missing mass at some time in the past. Even very short-span sampling did not show anything missing, but this was chalked up to a lack of precision in measuring. The reality waves were measurable, sort of. The biological samples were thousands of times smaller than the amount of cellular material a human sloughs off naturally in a day. There is literally no way to notice such a small sample being taken more than a few days in the past. Many sampling events, if they don't capture a nucleus, may even leave the sampled cell alive. The samples are tiny. The small sample size also allowed us to leave no trace when we pulled bits of the past into the present. Of the things that justified making time travel so regulated was the possibility of altering everything as a result of the sampling. However, there was no way single or properly spaced sampling events could impact the past. We couldn't even really tell they had happened. That's not to say that coordinated sampling events could not impact the past. I steered so clear of this possibility that I included a paradox risk assessment in all of my sampling protocols. The risk associated with the event causing sampling was infinitesimal, essentially zero. There were people who thought altering the past could be a good idea. There had even been a plot to create a control parameter batch file using newsreel footage of a Triumph of the Will Nazi rally in 1934 Nuremberg to target Hitler. The idea was to sample Hitler's neck billions and billions of times, till his head separated from his neck mid-speech. Nobody really thought killing Hitler was a bad idea, but the paradox it would cause might have been with catastrophic implications. What I had accomplished by bringing a huge sphere of the past forward in time should have catastrophic consequences, only everything looked like it survived. In fact, there were no significant changes to history. Hundreds of people spent hundreds of hours scouring history to see if anything changed before the question of how they would even notice a change was repeated loud enough to halt the searching under a mountain of doubt. I stopped in my tracks, and Paul stopped too. What I've accomplished here is an unambiguous displacement event. It can be used to validate or break all the theoretical models for how reality works. Time and matter may be in flux. This could set up waves that will resonate through all of time. We may be able to push things forward and backward in time. I was growing increasingly excited. Paul, this could mean so much. Listen to me. I've accomplished. A few paragraphs back, I was insisting it was not my fault to anyone who would listen. Now, in my newly, freshly showered focus on how interesting the event was, I was even forgetting about the smell of basil in the air. So, Bob, if you bring this stuff forward in time and replace the material here, then what happens to the material you have here? Does it switch with the material, the stuff from back in time? Where does it go? Asked Paul. I don't know, I answered. It should be impossible to bring forward enough material to make any difference. What happened all the time the material was being brought forward. For years, things happened in that space, and now it is here. Or is that space in the museum not really that space in the museum, but a perfect recreation of that space in the museum? Did everything that happened in the museum since we transported the space in the museum happen there? Or did it happen someplace else that was the space in the museum until the space in the museum got switched with it? You are not doing a good job of holding on to the appearance of sanity with your explanations right now, stated Paul. Maybe you should stick to a description of what you saw and then just say you don't know about the stuff you don't know about. That timey-wimey paradox stuff starts out crazy and then starts digging a hole. It is crazy, I replied. It is impossible. Time travel is crazy impossible, stated Paul. It just can't be done. Yet, some people insist on doing it. Some people like you. You have been listening to Chapter 6 of the Bubble Bath Paradox, written and read by Steve Parker, with music by the stupendous Victor McSorley.